Hey, everybody, welcome aboard the starship Red May. Our mission is to go boldly where nobody has gone for many years, exploring communist planets all over the universe and visiting the. Before we get into Marxist poetics today, well, actually, no, I think we'll get into it right away. I want to introduce our moderator for the panel Marxist Poetics. David Lau, his poetry and essays have been published in New Left Review, Book Forum, Boston Review, and the Literary Hub. He's the author of collections of poetry, Virgil and the Mountain Cat, Bad Opposites, and Still Dirty from the much beloved gone publisher Commune Editions. David's got a new book of poetry and prose coming out soon. And he is the co-editor of the wonderful literary magazine Lana Turner, where you can find George Georg Lukács, Joshua Clover next to one another in the edition. And anyway, David, welcome back to Red May. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Philip.
Or at least your virtual thing. So I will. I'll lurk in the background here and turn it over to you.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Red May and to the Marxist Poetics panel. It's my great pleasure to be back at Red May for the first time since 2018 and in this virtual format. I'm going to present a few comments about our two panelists today, and then I'll turn it over to them. Isn't poetry the dream of weapons? Asked the American surrealist poet Philip Lamantia in the title of a late poem. Poetry is not innocent, certainly, and it does have consequences, as many on the communist left of poetry have known all too well. Prison, exile, publishing bans have been the heavy counteroffensive against the poetic weapon of the word in proletarian struggle. Criticism, too, has further silenced voices by ignoring left poetics or strategically understudying left or Marxist poets who fell outside the orbit of the Euro-American modernist canon. But there have been alternative traditions of criticism that for many years have unearthed and begun to recover the past of Marxist poetics. The work of Carrie Nelson is synonymous with this attempt to restore a more holistic picture of the poetics of the 20th century, and likewise the works of James Murphy have looked keenly into the proletarian moment in American literature. But the proletarian poetry of the 20th century is not a one-sidedly national phenomenon, and today we need an international and multilingual approach to Marxist poetics to bring the international question of poetics and practice into full view. Sarah Ehlers' 2019 book, Left of Poetry, Depression, America, and the Formation of Modern Poetics, provides a useful historicizing corrective to the ways in which our current formations of poetics prevent us from seeing Red Decade 1930s poetry in its actuality, lyric, documentary, militant, while taking shape in a time of third period and popular front Comintern politics. If we have reduced our understanding of this period of left poetics, she is expanding the considered range of authors and periodicals to give us a fuller view of the times. Her aim is to pick up critically from Nelson and Michael Denning and construct a Poets International of the 1930s as counterpart to Denning's Novelists International in his celebrated The Cultural Front. Speaking of a Poets International, the scholar and poet Aditya Bahl is today writing and publishing a series of essays on the Marxist intellectuals and poets of India, including an essay on Varavara Rao, the oft-imprisoned Telugu poet and leading Marxist intellectual, as well as a moving essay on his encounters with Maoist poets, writers, and editors in Punjab, which revolves around his relation of the Maoist poet Avtar Singh Pash, whose works as an editor, poet, and political figure ground Aditya's exploration of what remains of the literary productions, Fragments of a Revolution, from the 1960s and 1970s period of Naxalite rebellions and class struggles, setting political fire across rural India. Since the 2008 financial crisis, a Marxist Poetics has emerged as a site of practice and literary critical inquiry. The works of notable critics like Xian Nai have likewise undergone a further Marxification in terms of conceptualization and approach. Nai and others' examination of the present conditions of aesthetic production under conditions of late capitalism are now finding their complements in the past considerations of radical and more straightforwardly Marxist poetics in the works of Ellers and Bahl. It is my pleasure to introduce both writers to the Red May audience. My hope is that this panel contributes to our understanding of on the contemporary left of what Ellers calls a, quote, provisional geography of an internationalist communist imaginary. In their recent critical works, we can see in Bahl's phrase, quote, the intimacy between literary experiment, critique of political economy, and political agitation. We will start this panel by hearing from Aditya Bahl, and after that, we will hear from Sarah Ehlers. There will be a brief break to promote Red May, and I will moderate a discussion, a question and answer period following Sarah's talk. And with that, Aditya Bahl.
Hi, thanks, David, for the lovely introductions. And thanks for setting us up here at Red May. Very pleased to be a part of Marxist Poetics. And thank you to everyone for joining in wherever you are. Before I start, I just wanted to add I'm in India right now, and it's 11:30 in the night here. And for the past couple of weeks, we are having some intermittent power cuts because of national coal shortage. And so in case I disappear for a little bit and then miraculously reappear, I hope you'll understand. Anyway, for the past couple of years, I've been trying to recover an archive of small magazines that were published in Punjab, India, during the 1960s and 70s. In this period, the Punjabi countryside was completely transformed by the clash between the US-sponsored Green Revolution and the Mao-inspired Naxalite insurgency. I will come to this clash in a moment, but as for the magazines, especially the underground ones, they were frequently banned and destroyed by the police. And today, only fragments survive, scattered across obscure, rural, and peri-urban locations. Something to keep in mind that Punjab is predominantly an agrarian province. So if post-colonial scholars categorize the Indian state as the periphery, then Punjab is the periphery of this Indian periphery. At the end of late 1960s, nearly 80% of its population lived in villages. And yet, the Punjabi magazines that I've been able to recover so far are hardly peripheral in character. Instead, they are very worldly, very cosmopolitan, very internationalist. These magazines regularly translated and engaged the works of Roland Barthes, Franz Fanon, the Bulgarian poet Nikolai Vaptsarov, the Uzbek poet Zulfiya, the German psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, the Black radical George Jackson, Lukács, Sartre, and many others. These translations and criticisms were then differently juxtaposed and combined with the works of local Punjabi writers, all of diverse political convictions. There were Nehruvian socialists, there were party comrades, there were heterodox Marxists, and there were, of course, the self-styled Maoist guerrillas. Now, this conjunction of the hyper-transnational and the hyper-peripheral is quite startling. When I first started my fieldwork, I was not prepared for this at all. The very first artifact I discovered was a faded black and white photograph. Let me try to pull it up for you. Yeah. A Sikh man is standing between a newly married Sikh couple, holding a book in each hand. His bearded face is scratched beyond recognition. The bride stares solemnly into the camera. The groom is angling away, perhaps for another camera. The caption reads, Comrade Bugger Singh is handing out a new form of dowry to the couple. The dowry is two novels in Punjabi translation, Mother by Maxim Gorky and The Hurricane by Chowli Po. The magazine fragment which contained this photograph was undated, but likely from the early 1970s. Living in the shadows of the Sino-Soviet split, the Punjabi comrades had been trying to integrate Bolshevik and Maoist novelists into their dowry rituals. I was astonished by the discovery. As I uncovered more pieces of this archival puzzle, I grew even more astonished. In fact, in those early days, I was persistently astonished by everything I saw. Ethnographers often say that astonishment is the presiding affect of one's preliminary fieldwork, and that over time one grows accustomed to the realities of one's field. But I have since realized that my astonishment was historical in nature, and that there are historical reasons to explain why I was feeling this way. The most prominent being that this radical leftist culture has now been almost completely wiped away. First, by the police crackdowns in the 1970s. Second, by the Khalistani separatists in the 1980s, who probably killed even more communists than the police did. And finally, by the catastrophic breakdown of the Green Revolution in the 1990s, when a wave of peasant suicides ripped through the social fabric of Punjab's countryside. Lost in the ruins of post-colonial Punjab, this was not just a photograph. In that moment, it was almost like a talisman for me. Anyway, this conjunction of the hyper-transnational and the hyper-peripheral is quite startling, but it is not without historical precedent. After all, in the first half of the 20th century, Punjab had been the wellspring of raging anti-colonial internationalism. In 1913, a group of Punjabi migrant peasants had founded the Ghadar Party in San Francisco. And over the next 3 decades, the party became the leading anti-colonial organization across the world. Let me try and pull out a map for you. As you can see, the fugitive networks and revolutionary cells of the Ghadar Party spanned as far wide as Paris and Penang, Portland and Moscow, and Argentina and Fiji. The party trained its members in air warfare, secretly planted incendiary leaflets and war ammunition in ships bound for India, and sent several of its members for political training in Moscow. In the past decade or so, many historians have tracked these rich global histories. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much. What interests me instead is how, after the Indian independence in 1947, these networks of anti-colonial militancy, they were replaced by the apparatus of decolonial diplomacy. The protagonists of the post-colonial era were no longer the fugitive peasant rebels, who traveled in ships armed with concealed weapons and leaflets. Instead, the heroes of the new era were cultural bureaucrats, as well as professional writers and translators, who now began to represent India at Third World conferences. Most prominently, the Bandung Conference of 1956, but also the Tashkent Literary Conference of 1958, and the Afro-Asian Writers' Conferences that would be held between 1960s and 1980s. So only a select literary and political figures now had the privilege to cross national borders. They also had the responsibility to first introduce Indian literary works into the cultural spheres of their diplomatic neighbors, primarily the Soviet Union, and second, to introduce the works of their foreign compatriots into Indian languages, and on some occasions to supplement these translations with their own travelogues and memoirs. In recent years, we have seen a number of fascinating cultural histories of the Afro-Asian literatures, and especially of the relationship with Soviet literary networks. These accounts are now starting to offer a formidable challenge to the official canons of literary departments in the West. But then I feel we also need to ask what happened to the organizers and writers who could no longer travel, who were fixed in the periphery, or as in the case of Punjab, the periphery of the Indian periphery. How did they comprehend the changing dynamics of post-war capitalism from their lowly vantage of rural villages? What kinds of books were they reading? What kind of political organizing were they doing? What kinds of books were they writing? What magazines were they printing? What resources and infrastructures did they have at their disposal? Were they able to create any alternative leftist print cultures? And most importantly, why did these people lose? Or more accurately, why were they defeated? I feel that this tension between the official histories of the Third World Project and the overlooked vernacular cultures of movements like Naxalism can be quite productive for us. And in the remaining time that I have, I would like to illuminate this tension a little bit. And especially emphasize that the kind of history we write is always directly dependent on the kind of archive that we are able to uncover. And that if we can attune our ears and listen to this minor voice of small Punjabi Maoist magazines, then we would hear a very different kind of decolonial music. So I'll start by referring to two of the most prolific Punjabi writers who traveled extensively into the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The first is Gurbaksh Singh, who edited the legendary magazine Preet Ladi. The second is Amrita Prietam, who edited the illustrious literary monthly Nagmani. I have these two photographs that were published in Preet Ladi. These were clicked somewhere around 1957, a year before the Tashkent Literary Conference actually took place, which is often understood to be like laying the foundation for the Afro-Asian literary solidarity and its exchanges with Soviet literary networks over the next 2 or 3 decades. And this photograph, both of these photographs were taken in Preetnagar, which is a small rural artists' commune, writers' commune, that was founded by Gurbaksh Singh Preet Ladi, who's sitting at the center of this photograph right here. And also, so he was basically hosting a Soviet delegation that was visiting, a Soviet delegation of writers. And on the far left, here is Anatoly Sofronov, who was the secretary of the Moscow Writers' Union starting in 1960, I think. More notoriously, he was also the most famous literary hangman of Stalin era. The second photograph, here is Amrita Prietam on the far left, and right next to her is the poet, the Uzbek poet Zulfiya. Both of these poets were embedded in the Afro-Asian literary networks of the early 1960s, both published in the magazine Lotus that was edited from Cairo in those days. And Zulfiya was one of only 2 female poets or 2 female writers to have won the prestigious Lotus Award. which was basically considered to be the Nobel Prize of Literature for like Afro-Asian writers at the time. And Amrita Prietam was, of course, her literary translator into Punjabi. And again, this photograph was also taken on the same trip, 1957, when the Soviet delegation was visiting Preetnagar, an artists and writers commune in Punjab. Beginning in the 1960s, Amrita Prietam traveled extensively, not just to Moscow, but also to Bulgaria, to Hungary, to Yugoslavia, to Tajikistan, and many other Soviet satellites. Her work was translated in all of these regions and became quite popular. Artists turned her novels into radio dramas, musicians wrote sonatas dedicated to her, that kind of thing. In Nagmani, she regularly published her travelogues, which have never been translated into English, sadly. And I feel even in the Punjabi literary sphere, these are little known. On the left is her travelogue of her visit to Yugoslavia. And on the right is her travelogue of the visit to Hungary. On the cover is the sketch of the portrait of the Hungarian radical poet Attila József. The magazine, the Nagmani, the magazine also had a wide range of literary interests, which in some ways reflected the interests of its editor, Amrita Prietam, who introduced into the Punjabi language poets from Bulgaria, from Greece, from Yugoslavia, from Hungary, many other cities and countries in Eastern Europe. And she supplemented these translations of poetry with accounts of the literary and political debates that were happening in these regions at the time, which is mostly mid-1960s. To give you an idea of the literary diversity of Nagmani, on the left, there is a special issue of Hungarian poets with sketches of all the individual poets at the time. On the right is a May 1968 issue that was dedicated to Martin Luther King, who had been assassinated a few weeks ago. And what is curious, though, is, that despite this formal diversity, literary diversity, which is quite unparalleled in many ways, the magazine had some obvious blind spots. For instance, it had very little to say about the political and economic transformations that were happening in the Cold War, especially in Punjab, where the magazine was rooted. For example, there is not a single word about the Green Revolution. Suddenly, the villages in Punjab were awash in tractors, harvest combines, tube wells, credit cooperatives, seed farms, and so on. And a new wave of landlessness and indebtedness was starting to unravel. And yet, we rarely find a mention of any of this in the magazine. The silence is quite disconcerting. But if Amrita Prietam was silent, the case of Gurbaksh Singh is even more absurd. This is a typical cover of the Preetleri, and I feel you can feel this Nehruvian socialism dripping from the cover, and also socialist realism. That was one of the cornerstones of the magazine. What is interesting, though, is that beginning in the late 1960s, the magazine began to publish many young Naxalite poets who condemned the growing indebtedness and landlessness in the Punjabi countryside, which is very interesting, because they often invoked images from the history of Sikh religious martyrdom and openly advocated a Maoist armed insurrection against the ruling Congress regime. Needless to say, they also broke away from the traditional poetic forms. But at the same time, the magazine also openly celebrated the implementation of Green Revolution across rural Punjab. It carried full-page advertisements for the peasant fairs. Many of them were organized by the Punjab Agriculture University. The magazine was replete with advertisements for tractors, for tube wells, for diesel engines, and so on. To make things even more absurd, the magazine started a monthly column called Nama Kisan, the new peasant. This, for instance, is one of the exhibits of Nawa Kisan, where agronomists would regularly write about what kind of fertilizers to use to increase the yield of watermelons, or in this case, to increase the yield of green chilies in your garden. And yet, on the very next page, you would find a translation of a poem by Mahmood Darwish, done by the poet Amarjit Chandan. I think the most absurd instance that I found in the archives of Preetlery is the following. On the left-hand side, there is like a 3-page report, the conclusion of a 3-page report on one of the peasant fairs held during the Green Revolution. This is one of the entrepreneurial peasant who is being awarded here by M.S. Randhawa, who was the architect of Green Revolution in many ways in Punjab. He's being awarded a radio because he is one of the most entrepreneurial peasants in the region, and he is chosen to implement the new high-yielding variety seeds that were being sent from the United States at the time. And he's chosen to use tube wells, he's chosen to use tractors, and he's chosen to use the mechanized new regime. He's chosen to be a part of the new mechanized regime of Green Revolution. On the right-hand side, you can see the fidelity to a certain notion of red revolution. It's a eulogy written to Lenin. In fact, this was a special issue dedicated to Lenin at the time. And the poem is set in Bulgaria, coincidentally, in Sofia, in the streets of Sofia, where Lenin is giving a lecture, a political lecture. And what is even more surprising is that Gurbaksh Singh did little to put these contradictions in perspective. Instead, every issue turned out to be a precipitous montage, swerving wildly between the national developmentalism of the Congress Party and the insurrectionary zeal of local Naxalites. And in moments like these, Gurbaksh Singh silently, subtly suggested that there was a political resonance between the kind of productivism that was advocated by Lenin in the war-ravaged Soviet Union at the end of 1920 and a kind of like capitalist productivism that was being encouraged by the Congress Party at the time by invoking Green Revolution or by advocating Green Revolution in the rural villages. So this in brief is the situation with these two magazines which were embedded in the Afro-Asian networks aligned with the Soviet Union at the time, who were quite otherwise critical of the US hegemony, who were quite critical of the Western literary sphere, of the CIA interventions in the writers' congresses in India, and so on and so forth. But their own politics at home was quite suspicious. Of course, not every Punjabi writer who traveled to Soviet Union suffered from these blind spots. There is a very curious case of Gurvel Pannu, who was an obscure short story writer who used to work in the Soviet embassy in New Delhi. He went to Moscow in 1969, and he was so disenchanted by the failures of the Soviet experiment that he decided to come back and start a Marxist journal of theory and culture, which was called SAID. I think it took its design inspiration from Monthly Review of the 1970s. And in fact, Monthly Review was regularly cited by some of the authors of SAID at the time. And the magazine on the whole did share similar political convictions and also similar scholarly rigor. Although I must add that the magazine was much more playful than Monthly Review, as I'll shortly describe. So when Gurvel Pannu returned to the Soviet embassy to return to his day job at the Soviet embassy and started this magazine, the Soviet officials in India obviously came to know about it. And they came to know about, the magazine was publishing like trenchant criticisms of Soviet economism and even trenchant critics of Lenin's embrace of economism at the time. And there was a lot of pressure put on Gurvel Pannu for discontinuing this magazine, but he chose to quit his job and became a full-time editor of the magazine. And the magazine really bloomed for the next 10 years. And it included engagements with French structuralism, often directly from French. With Roland Barthes in particular, an entire issue was dedicated to him. With medieval Sufi thinkers, with Erich Fromm, with contemporary Naxalite poets, with Charles Bettelheim, amongst many others. In a series of landmark essays, the literary critic Kishan Singh warned against the wholesale embrace of Leninism, especially the economistic biases of Leninism. And instead, he suggested that Marxism in Punjab must discover its own local roots, which was a very controversial suggestion at the time, especially in the official party circles. Kishan Singh prodded on, and he decided to celebrate Gurbani, which was the compositions in the Sikh religious scripture, Guru Granth Sahib, as a counterpoint to Marxist Leninism. Because he argued that the religious ethos of Sikhism offered a more expansive, more universal humanism than the Soviet bureaucracy could manage at the time. And these debates obviously provoked heated controversies in the literary sphere at the time. But what was most interesting about, unlike both Preet Lurry and Nagmani, what was really interesting, I feel, looking back at the archives about Said, is how it cultivated a strange montage in its table of contents. It didn't shy away from pitting critiques of political economy next to literary analysis of oral folk forms. It didn't like refrain from translating Western Marxists and criticizing them, right next to historical analysis of the progressive dimensions of the Sikh religion. So it was a very interesting moment, the early 1970s, in the archives of Said. And this specific form of the montage, the literary montage, it was actually perfected by the Naxalite magazines, the small magazines. Unlike both Preet Lurry and Said, the archives of these underground, small Naxalite magazines are very rare to find. I'll show a sample here. This is Role Ban. It's called Raging Arrows. And this is one of the few issues that I've been able to uncover. And as you can see, what is really fascinating about the magazine is the title, first of all, Raging Arrows, because the arrows directly refer to the first arrows that were fired by the tribals in West Bengal, who fired on the police in the inaugural Naxalite insurrection. And yet for these Punjabi Maoists, these arrows are also emblematic of the arrow that used to be held by Guru Gobind Singh, a 17th century Sikh guru who fought many guerrilla wars against the oppressive Mughal administration. And on every cover of this magazine, you would find an icon of Guru Gobind. Not Mao Tse-tung, not Mao, not Charu Majumdar, or any of the other local Naxal leaders, but Guru Gobind, which is almost blasphemous, not for the Sikh religion, which is very political and very politicized, but for the CPIML, the Marxist-Leninists of India, who of course were like hardcore atheists in many ways. And this was like a radical departure. And sometimes these constellations took strange but very exhilarating forms. For example, in this issue of Role Ban, which is much less tattered actually, you can find on the cover, it's a special issue dedicated to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And on the cover, there is George Habash. And this is a brief biography of Dr. George Habash and the pitfalls of the armed liberation struggle that is happening in Palestine. And on the cover, you can still see Guru Gobind. In fact, one of the popular slogans that was used by these Naxalites was Guru Gobind is our chairman, which is a radical departure from Chairman Mao. They chose to find their chairman in Guru Gobind. Anyway, David has mentioned the Punjabi poet Avtar Singh Pash, and I feel that the Maoist montage was perfected in every single issue of CR, which translates to furrow. And you can get the sense from what kind of magazine this was, which made agitprop great again. And the cover is all these wheat. The wheat yields were really increasing at the time with the high yielding variety seeds that were being transported and supplied by the United States. And these wheat seeds, of course, are in Pash's imagination, it was not the Green Revolution that mattered, it was the Red Revolution that mattered. So I'll quickly end my talk with this brief description of one of the issues of CR. You can find like 4 pages of anti-capitalist bolis. Boli is like a folk musical form in rural Punjab that is followed by an economic analysis titled Green or Red Revolution, where rates of profit, rates of indebtedness, and rates of landlessness are contrasted with each other. This is like a short essay, 3-page essay. 4 pages of oral bolis, 3 pages of this political economic essay, followed by a full page of ghazal, followed by I was like surprised to discover this, a translation of Jean-Paul Sartre. In the same year, same month actually, Roland Barthes published an issue which published, like it opened with like a polemical essay called Machine or Commune, which was a polemical comparison between the Indian and Chinese models of agrarian revolution. You know, it was again squeezed between like a short sheaf of poems by the Naxalite poets and an essay by a towering revolutionary of the Ghadar revolution who spent most of his life in Turkey and Afghanistan. The essay was, of course, why, under the rule of capitalism, democratic elections are a farce. Similarly, in 1970, an issue of Lakir magazine, which was like run by one of the fellow travelers of the Naxalites, you know, the poems of Lal Singh Dil, who was the first noted Dalit Maoist, were introduced alongside the first Punjabi translation of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. A month later, more of Dil's poems were published, now on the same page as translations of Mayakovsky. And the issue also featured translations of Jean-Paul Sartre and the German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger. So briefly, before I conclude, you know, the point that I have in my mind is how different kinds of archives lead to different kinds of histories. So if we are going to focus on like the Afro-Asian literary networks and the presence of Punjabi writers in those networks, writers like Gurbaksh Singh Preetladi, writers like Amrita Prietam, you know, who also translated several of the Soviet and Soviet satellite writers into Punjabi, we will get a specific kind of historical narrative, right? And there is a certain glamour associated, I feel, to these figures, because these figures seem more cosmopolitan. These figures seem to cross borders rather easily. These figures are prolific translators. These figures are prolific writers as well. If we contrast these magazines with the small and underground magazines like Roland Barthes, edited by people that nobody these days hears of, even in Punjabi literary circles, let alone in the West, you know, we get a different sense of the kind of tensions between literature and tensions between politics that these guys were charting, you know. And they offer a different kind of challenge to the scholarship, because to read and analyze these scholarships, you also have to develop a critical methodology that is like equal to the challenge of parsing these montages. Because you'll inevitably have to read like critiques of political economy. You would inevitably have to deal with the long history of Sikh religion. You would inevitably have to deal with like these older Indo-Islamic poetic forms like the ghazal or the marsiya, you know, which were being populated with new contents. And most importantly, there is also the bigger challenge of knowledge production. And I'll end with this brief anecdote from my fieldwork, you know. And this is again like from 2.5 years ago, before the pandemic, and I had like attended a fieldwork workshop in the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins and come straight to Punjab to do my fieldwork. And I met this old woman who had participated in the Naxalite struggle. And I was like really eager to, you know, use all of the ethnographic tricks that I had used in my workshop, which is basically about how to make your interlocutors talk. I was very eager to interview her and to make her talk. Before I could ask her a question, she asked me, what have you done for the leftist movement so far? And I was like really stumped because I didn't expect such a question. And I was like, before I could answer, and she was like, well, do you want to talk to me as an ethnographer or do you want to talk to me as a comrade? And I hesitantly said, a comrade. And she said, but then you'll have to prove me that you're a comrade. And I was like, so how do I do that now? And she was like, you will have to tell me your involvement in the leftist struggle and what have you done so far? And I was like stumped for a little while. And again, before I could answer this question, she began to ask me more questions. And some of these questions have stuck with me ever since, One of the questions she asked me, like, what language are you going to write your dissertation in? And I said, in the English language. And she said, I can't read it. And she asked me, where are you going to publish your dissertation? And I was like, probably in the West. And she was like, well, I can't read it. So what kind of a comrade are you? So on that note, I'll pause here. I'll end my talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for that, Aditya. That was great. And up next, we're going to hear from Sarah Ehlers. Again, she published a 2019 book, Left of Poetry, that has really been thought-provoking for me, and I'm very excited to see what she has to say today.
Thank you. I just wanted to start by just saying that I'm thankful to the Red May organizers and to David for organizing us, and I'm just very grateful to be part of this conversation. So today I'm going to talk about the main arguments of my book, Left of Poetry, which David has already mentioned. The book returns to the pro-communist poetic culture that flourished during the Great Depression, and it unearths a range of archival materials and poetic theories to tell part of the cultural history of left poetry in the US. And as part of what I talk about today, I'll mention some specific poets and poems, and also share some of my more recent thinking about the politics and practices of recovery within the sort of specific archival and literary context of the Depression left. But I want to start with a moment that struck me in Doris Lessing's novel, The Golden Notebook, when the protagonist, the British ex-communist Anna Wolfe, says that the really deadly skeleton in the communist closet is that everyone has an old manuscript or wad of poems tucked away. Isn't it terrifying? Isn't it pathetic? She muses. Every one of them failed artists. I'm sure it's significant of something, if only one knew what. At its most basic level, the goal of my research has been to find the skeletons in the communist closet and figure out why they might be significant. I write alongside and with debts to scholars in the field of left literary studies who have retrieved the variegated artistic and intellectual fronts of the 20th century international communist movement. These scholars have drawn on earlier recovery projects by scholars like Michael Denning, Carrie Nelson, Alan Wald, and Mary Helen Washington to reconceive labor struggles, Black liberation, intersectional feminism, and anti-imperialist solidarity against formations of Cold War liberal capitalist modernity. In my book, I consider understudied aspects of well-known poets such as Langston Hughes's engagements with photography in US-occupied Haiti and Muriel Rukeyser's experiments with modern film. I also think about debates about the expressive lyric that emerged in communist journals and magazines, correspondence and translations related to the imprisonment of Haitian communist poet Jacques Roman, unpublished works by communist poet Martha Millett that rewrite the stories of poetic innovation that have continued to influence discourses about poetry and politics. I also read radio scripts, popular songs, nursery rhymes, and ballads with the aim of expanding our sense of the terrain on which Depression-era communist writers composed socially engaged poems and waged struggles over the relationship between poems as objects and poetry as a set of claims about what poems can do. In an era that witnessed an unprecedented growth of the organized left in resistance to economic inequality, racial injustice, and military and financial imperialism, there was a demand for poems that were imbricated in immediate conditions. While such conditions and demands are not unique to the 30s part of my suggestion is that the 30s remains a crucible for understanding the history of poetics and poetic genres, as well as the role of poetry and poetic thought in conceptualizing historical change. And I look to Langston Hughes's 1928 poem, Johannesburg Mines, as an example of a poem that thinks through these shifts. And it's a short poem, so I'll just read it. In the Johannesburg mines, there are 240,000 natives working. What kind of poem would you make out of that? 240,000 natives working in the Johannesburg mines. Hughes's poem offers a provisional answer to its own question. What kind of poem would you make out of that just by existing? Hughes suggests that the very existence or status of the poem changes when it attempts to represent the violence of capitalism's uneven development. Johannesburg Mines demonstrates how the imperative to make art that addresses the inequities of capitalism was opposed to a conception of poetry also forming in the early 20th century, in which poetry had become synonymous with pure expressiveness and absolute literariness. As they debated what kind of poem could be made in the fray of political struggle, Depression left poets altered the ideation of poetry in the early 20th century by soldering it to ideals of collectivity and collective political action. During the 30s, narratives about poetry confronted a new sense of history marked by urgency and crisis. At this intersection, left-leaning poets encountered not merely a social poetry, that is kind of a renewal of poetry's engagement with mass audiences or with social movements, but also a sense of its alterity and alternatives. Returning to the literary cultures and debates of this moment, when, as Edmund Wilson wrote, it had become plain that the economic crisis was to be accompanied by a literary one, has stakes for the critical histories and interpretive paradigms that have guided North American poetics, paradigms that have continued to influence what gets taught and how, as well as what gets published and circulated. While much of the critical work on Depression left poetry has so far emphasized left poets' exclusion from the modernist canon and the legacies of new critical repression, I highlight how discourses that emerged in the wake of and in opposition to new criticism also included major traditions and trajectories of socially engaged poetics. And I've often gone back to an anecdote that I found in a letter that Maria Zadarenska, a poet, wrote to Harriet Monroe when she reported that Louis Zukofsky had finally decided to cut himself off from Ezra Pound and was left with, as Zadarenska put it, no God, no Ezra, no nothing. She described how Zukofsky was going to try communism and has gone around humbly to CP headquarters asking for guidance. The cultural directors gave him a lot of proletarian poetry, but naturally it was difficult to swallow after Ezra, who is, after all, a craftsman. The elision of a diverse array of poetry produced within the Depression communist movement, however hard a pill it is to swallow perhaps, not only potentially re-entrenches established aesthetic values, but also potentially elides the significant feminist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist dimensions of early 20th century communist literatures, and also communist literary formations. So Left of Poetry leverages this historical work to make a set of claims about the foreclosed spaces in which discourses about poetry, politics, and history currently operate. When I began writing the book, the Great Recession precipitated an interest in the economic crisis of the Depression, and post-2008 mass political movements prompted the need or an interest in further prehistories of anti-capitalist poetics. But I also ask if and how the archive of left poetics imposes on our current moment, forcing a reconsideration of the relationships between the economic, historical, and poetic planes. Can a return to the past alter the logics of socially engaged poetry in our contemporary moment? How might such a return allow us to speculate on possibilities for how an ideal of poetry might provide the coordinates of the radical imagination, to paraphrase a statement from Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams? In his contemporary meditation on Lenin, Tariq Ali writes, "Today's dominant ideology and the power structures it defends are so hostile to the social and liberation struggles of the last century that a recovery of as much historical and political memory as is feasible becomes an act of resistance. In these bad times, even the anti-capitalism on offer is limited. It is apolitical and ahistorical." In many ways, my book takes up Ellie's argument that the recovery of historical and political memory is a form of resistance, especially as thinkers construct new archives that interrupt what Benjamin Balthasar describes in his own work on the anti-imperialism of the cultural front as the violence to history the Cold War security state has forced on our cultural memory. Nonetheless, the work involved in writing Left of Poetry has engendered further thinking about the utility of recovering the communist-affiliated writers excised from predominant literary historical narratives, raising two questions. One about the significance left artistic cultures of the past might have for the present, and one about the stakes and practices of literary recovery as such work takes place within the institutional context of the U.S. University and Archive. As David asked in his recent essay on Mark Novak's social poetics, which I'm still thinking about, what can be made of political aesthetics of the older Marxist stripe rooted in the workers' movement? As I think about these questions, two poems come to mind. Tilly Olson's 1934 poem, I Want You Women Up North to Know, and Muriel Rukeyser's 1938 sequence, The Book of the Dead. Both are significant for the ways they've continued to circulate as exemplary documents of old left poetic culture, as well as for the way that the poems themselves, which employ novel documentary poetic techniques, tell us something about practices of representation, archiving, and recovery. Olson's 1934 poem, I Want You Women Up North to Know, is closely based on a letter by Mexican-American activist Felipe Ibarro that was published in the communist-affiliated journal New Masses. Around the time Olson wrote the poem, she had been organizing on assembly lines, writing investigative journalism for Communist Party publications, and printing leaflets in her apartment. The opening stanzas of Olson's poem shift Ibarro's epistolary missive, I Want You Women Up North to Know, into poetic lines. Like the letter, Olson's poem details exploitative labor conditions, particularly for garment workers in the U.S. South, and the complicity of middle and upper-class white women consumers in perpetuating those conditions. Olson criticizes the bourgeois poet that would render these realities in art vis-a-vis the metaphoric transformation of pained hands into, and these are lines from the poem, white rain stitching the night, white gulls of hands darting, veering, white lightning threading the clouds. I Want You Women Up North to Know is one of the primary examples of U.S. left labor poems that Novak cites in his prose book, Social Poetics. In one chapter, Novak details how he uses I Want You Women Up North to Know as a central text in his worker-writer poetry workshops because of its style of direct address, its effective use of the second person, and its use of concrete images and effects. For Novak, Olson's poem stands as an example of what he calls transnational worker solidarity that he argues, following Raymond Williams, allows contemporary activists to recreate the materials of the past as, and these are his words, a roadmap to a better future. In Novak's examples, the poem creates space for doing cultural memory work and for processing questions about labor exploitation and relations. Such modes of recreation, however empowering, perhaps miss other aspects of poems such as Olson's, including their place in histories of working class literature and left resistance movements. For example, the scholar Sonali Pereira argues that Olson's writing, quote, produces the concept of working class history as always partial, uncompleted, and anti-developmentalist. For Pereira, Olson's poem, as well as her unfinished novel Yanandio, pose questions about what it means to celebrate the cultural legacy of the US left now, providing, and these are her words, counterpoints to triumphalist recovery projects. Olson's own hesitation about reception and commodification provide warnings to bourgeois poets then and now, as Pereira writes, the poem's documentary practice exemplifies a materialist feminist historiographic practice that anticipates with uncanny prescience feminist negotiations within globalization. The uncanny prescience that Pereira locates in Olson's I Want You Women Up North to Know has been discerned recently in other accounts of the pro-communist left, such as in Patrick Chura's recent biography of Mike Gold. Her account of this history, as always partial and incomplete, also reframes the history and present reception of works like Muriel Rukeyser's The Book of the Dead, a documentary poem sequence that attempts to represent the industrial catastrophe in Golly Bridge, West Virginia, where at least 700 men, a large proportion of whom were Black migrant workers, died from the pernicious lung disease silicosis. Published in 1938, the Book of the Dead has become a touchstone in conversations about contemporary committed poetry. And indeed, I begin Left of Poetry with an anecdote from David Buke and Juliana Sparr's short story, What We Talk About When We Talk About Poetry, in which one of the characters, a poet professor and former union organizer, retells the story of the 1984 Bhopal disaster to prove the point that poems make nothing happen. He concludes his assessment of Rukeyser's poem. It is impossible not to be moved by this poem. It is a clear, strong poem, a famous poem. People read it and it did nothing. 50 years later, Union Carbide, Bhopal, boom, nothing. In short, it doesn't matter how we read a poem about how the Union Carbide Corporation facilitated one of the worst industrial disasters in history. It'll do nothing to stop them from doing it again. And maybe that's the poem's warning signal, or at least one of them. The 2018 reprint of Rukeyser's The Book of the Dead is packaged with an introductory essay by the Appalachian writer Catherine Venable Moore. In the essay, Moore travels to Gauley Bridge, tracing Rukeyser's steps, undertaking historical research, and conducting interviews with descendants of the people that Rukeyser wrote about in her poem who were affected by the disaster. Of particular interest to me is Moore's description of her encounter with the granddaughter of Emma Jones, the woman Rukeyser wrote about in the poem Absalom, one of the central sections of the Book of the Dead. Absalom tells the story of how Emma's husband and 3 sons died from silicosis. In a particularly moving part of the poem, Rukeyser retells how Emma's youngest son, Shirley, who was too sick to have x-rays made, asked for an autopsy so that the family could have just compensation. And I'll just read this small section of the poem. He lay and said, "Mother, when I die, I want you to have them open me up and see if that dust killed me. Try to get compensation. You will not have any way of making your living when we are gone and the rest are gone too." This part of the poem has long perplexed me for the way that it both relies on the recognition of the state, but also potentially represents a moment when the laborer represented in the poem is not reduced to a single image of the death inside of him. In Moore's introduction to the Book of the Dead, Shirley Jones's lungs reappear. Moore recounts how Shirley's doctor kept his promise of performing the autopsy and preserving the lungs in a jar. Years later, after the doctor died, the lungs were still in his basement. At some point, the late doctor's son and his wife loaded them up into the back of their pickup truck, drove them to the dump at the top of Cotton Hill Mountain, and chucked them over the side. What do we make of the contrast between these two attempts to prove an injustice? The poem is document, or document is poem, and the jar that preserves the lungs. In The Life of Poetry, Rukeyser writes that one of the legends of our buried poetry is the singing bones. But we are perhaps also left to ask, what do we go to the archive for? Rukeyser's process of documentary investigation and archival excavation intersect, sometimes in conflicting ways, with the work of women such as Emma Jones's granddaughters, who also initiated their own research into the tunnel tragedy. Emma Jones's granddaughter, Anita, conveyed to Moore that the incidents at Gauley Bridge are part of their family legacy, a legacy that includes the impacts of generational poverty. These women told Moore that they went to the archives looking, quote, for the death certificates of tunnel workers as a kind of self-fashioned therapy. Jones told Moore, "We just feel that us doing the research and finding out what happened, it helps us heal. I know it was before we were born, but we still have feelings about this." In thinking about how the materials of the poem circulate, I am reminded of Yoon Sung Kim's call to destroy notions of archival provenance that rely on capitalist, colonialist, and white supremacist notions of ownership, and ask instead, to quote Kim, "Where are your memories? Are you a witness? Who do you care for? What are you continuing? Who do you remember?" Anita Jones also told Moore, "My family is chained to that place by ghosts." Kim quotes Nelson Mandela's archivist, Fern Harris, who describes archival work as spectral. She sums it up, Harris posits that rather than finding the archive and owning it, we go into the archive because we are already haunted. The poems of this earlier era cannot be merely repurposed as formal roadmaps or as empty slogans for the collective solidarities and actions we want now, nor can the flourishing of the communisms of an earlier time slip into hagiography or a desire to recover only or merely revolutionary good feeling. The desire to redeem the past must be coupled with a desire to irrevocably change the present. So just moving toward a close, I want to revisit an anecdote from the introduction to Left of Poetry that I still often replay in my head. And in it, I cite a remark that I heard at a session on the radical novel several years ago now, probably more than I want to realize. When someone said, "I just don't know what a communist poetry would look like." At the time, the comment seemed symptomatic of Naporia and left literary scholarship, which had favored writing about prose fiction and been suspicious of poetry as an inherently conservative or at best liberal mode of expression. And for a long time, I saw the task as illuminating what a communist poetry looked like then to say something about what it could teach us now. But the poems written within the culture of the 1930s left were composed in the fray of specific historical and material struggles, using the ideologies and communities offered by diverse left organizations. The debates they waged had less to do with the semantics of what a communist poetry might look like, and more with what these poems might do in the service of real struggle. In my own research, I followed the writings of the communist organizer and writer Martha Millett from her daughter's basement in Boulder, Colorado, to a radical bookstore in San Francisco, to a special collections center at an East Coast Ivy League university. One of the manuscripts that had been waiting there was a meticulously researched indictment of Ezra Pound written at the end of the High Cold War. In the manuscript, Millett lamented how the people in the 30s, people in controlled motion, learning what their lives and grievances meant, and about the society that had them in its grip, had lost out to the rise of the conservative Southern agrarians who had, in her words, bided their time. Which leads to the question, what is it time for now? Maybe Kenneth Fearing said it most succinctly when during his interrogation by HUAC in the 1950s, he was asked if he was a member of the Communist Party, and he responded, "Not yet." Mackenzie Wark writes that what makes this quip so good is the enigma of the answer. Was it that he wasn't ready for the party, Wark writes, or that the party wasn't ready for him? Wark goes on to describe the world of a Fearing poem where, quote, "a woman in heels passes a man in a trench coat, the sun gleams off a polished office window, and each just misses stepping in a pile of dog shit. They will meet later over cocktails." And speaking of shit, there's a story that Kenneth Fearing was at an old left party and he was asked by, I think, Joseph Freeman to recite a poem, and he said, "Oh shit," and walked away. But I think that there's something in the notion of meeting later, maybe not in walking away. Indeed, Wait is the title of the Langston Hughes poem that perhaps more than any other piece of poetry that I wrote about in the book seems to say it all. The center of the poem is the speech of the Silent One, a revolutionary figure who represents a possible way out of systems of capitalist domination by the very act of occupying an impossible position. And this speech of the Silent One is surrounded by lists of words that name sort of sites and objects of struggle. The political and conceptual acts and ideals expressed in the poem do not yet coalesce. They are present, but in the process of formation. The silence in the poem is not an absence of action or an absence of voice, but rather a fierce withholding implied in the title's threat. Just you wait. Marx wrote that the social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but from the future. Is a Marxist Poetics anticipatory, awaiting the formations that will be communism, or is it a leveraging the conditions of the present in order to change the historical horizon that is dominated by capital? Perhaps it's both. Can poetry help us arrive at a future that realizes the hopes of Hughes's poem, one in which the guns are turned the other way and the world is made anew? The last line of my book is that it's high time we used poetry to get over poetry. And I mean to suggest that the Depression poets I discuss may allow us to move forward dialectically beyond the current parameters for thinking about art and its social uses. In other words, I wager that returning to the poetry of the 1930s may allow us to move past contemporary literary and sociopolitical paradigms that continue to limit our ability to form not only the poetry to come, but the world to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. I think we're going to hear from Philip right now. Philip, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that is correct. And I'm sorry to interrupt what will, after these presentations, one wants to throw oneself in right away to a discussion, but I have to bring us down to the base material of funding Red May. But first, I want to tell you what you will be funding, and specifically what you'll be seeing on our program for the rest of the month. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., Policing the City with Jared Shanahan, Donna Murch, Annie Gray Fisher, and Dan Berger as moderator. Jared has written a new book in addition to his book, States of Incarceration. He has a book on called Captives, How Rikers Island took possession of the city. That's not an exact title, but it's a fascinating notion. On next Thursday, we have a panel called Karl Marx, Historian of Social Times and Spaces. That's on 11 a.m. on Thursday the 12th. And it's a discussion of a book by George Garcia Quesada at the University of Costa Rica. Massimiliano Tomba will be on that panel, as will the people behind the wonderful podcast Real Abstractions, Cordelia Belton and Edward. And then on the 13th, Friday at 11 a.m., Revolution After Such Shipwrecks. Enzo Traverso has written a book from Verso called Revolutions in Intellectual History. Rebecca Carl will be on that panel along with Enzo. She has a book on China's revolutions in the modern world. Alberto Toscano will be on that. And AJ Singh Chaudhary will be of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, will be the moderator of that. On Saturday at 11 a.m. on the 14th of May, Remapping the Race Class Problematic. Chris Chen, as Sarika Chandra, the authors of an article by that name in the wonderful new anthology Totality Inside Out, that was edited by the late Kevin Floyd, a brilliant Marxist and literary person who we miss so much now. And then finally on the 14th at 3 p.m., a double header that day, The Global Afterlives of Slavery. Yogita Goya will talk about her book, Running Genres, which traces the kind of strange reappearance of the slave narrative to analogically explain all kinds of things, from migration to whatever, and how it's suddenly become omnipresent, while at the same time it's the reference to original slavery is effaced from Texas textbooks. So lots of very good stuff to watch at Red May. And you may wonder how we do this. In a certain way, it's been fairly easy to do 3 years of Red May online, and the expenses go way down. We're not paying for plane fares, but next year, fingers crossed, we go back to live Red May or a hybrid of live Red May with weekday online events from around the world, which we want to keep in Red May. But we will bring back the Marxathon and our general festive Saturnalia, which of course will be filmed. And we need money to do that. If you like what we do, go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and under donate, you have two choices. You can give to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or you can become a patron. And we have a Patreon on that. So we depend on the kindness of strangers, and we're depending on yours. And now let's get back to our conversation about these two wonderful presentations. I think I'll lurk in the background of this. I'd like to be present and maybe throw in a little comment from the side. So I'll turn it over to David Lau again.
Thanks, Philip, and great work organizing this in the digital context. And I see right away we have a question from the audience, and I think I'd like to turn to the audience. So if you do have questions, please feel free to post in the comments section on YouTube. Does that sound good, everyone? Just go to audience questions. Is that okay? Okay, so great talk. Love to hear people discuss. Connor May asks, discussing Rookheiser's poetry, and I'm a fan of Aditya's poetry since I read some of it in Data Bleed. Wonder what modern Marxist left poets can read now. Does anyone want to take that on? Or, I mean, one thing I would recommend are Aditya's essays and Sarah's book. And then, okay, bringing up Connor, some English poets. Definitely would second those authors. Philip already brought up Commune Editions, and I had a book published by them a number of years ago now, and there's been quite a few interesting Marxist poets published there. Another American publisher that comes to mind is Curbstone Press, which put out a bunch of books by Jack Hirschman, for example, Luis Rodriguez, kind of the more Marxist proletarian side of poetry after the 70s in the US. Would anyone else like to talk about that? Maybe Aditya, you could talk about some of your experience with that in other contexts outside of the US. Sarah, if you want to maybe talk about some scholarship or something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. Yeah, let me think. I think Lana Turner is a great journal, I would say. Yeah, that David co-edits. So that should be a go-to, I guess. Yeah, and then Commune Editions is there, obviously, and it's a tough question. Yeah, contemporary Marxist poetry. There is Tongo Eisen-Martin, who's writing some fantastic work. Who's been writing for a while now. Yeah. And what else? Yeah, I can't.
Tongo, another Red May veteran. We were up there in 2018 in Seattle, giving a series of readings and talks.
That was great.
Yeah, there's a kind of I would say there's Sarah's book. In a way, it kind of raises the question for contemporary anti-capitalist poetics of how to think about the past of Marxist or anti-capitalist poetics. And it also raises the question of the historical difference between the present and the past in a very interesting, thoughtful, and critical way. So for me, that's been very helpful to be in dialogue with her work and her book in that regard. Sarah, would you like to make a comment about this?
I mean, I was going to say, I'm always going back to the past. Maybe just because I was just mentioning him, but Kenneth Baring comes to mind to me as a poet that, from the earlier period that feels contemporary in certain ways. So I always recommend checking out his work also. And, in terms of contemporary scholarship, I think two books that I've leaned on a lot are Cheryl Higashida's book, Black Internationalist Feminism, which looks from the the kind of 30s and 40s all the way through up to the 80s. And also Ben Balthasar's book, Anti-Imperialist Modernism, which really digs into the kind of anti-imperialist dimensions of that earlier formation. And he has a lot of great essays about sort of thinking about some of these older writers, Josephine Herbst, Mike Gold, and others in the context of present day political movements and struggles. So I recommend their writing as well.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
I was going to say that there are different tasks that are necessary here. One is the recuperation and discovery and the excavation of such a large amount of writing that was foreclosed by the various definitions of poetry and what is art and what is not art. That is not so that's one notion, just within America itself. The other is the international dimension, which is always weak in America in terms of understanding that there are other countries out there and that there are people who are writing absolutely great poems that may not have been translated, but may be better than what you're reading yourself in the moment. So the I mean, I in a certain way, I think it's the poets who are writing now who are going to do for us as they do their own research and try to expand the tradition and to understand what tradition they themselves are part of, and to look for things that they can détourne a little bit, that will inspire them to do a slightly different version and add sort of bits from their own approaches to kind of expand what poetry can do and what it can talk about. I mean, I essentially, I think the most restrictive condition is the notion of poetry as something pure, where everything that goes into poetry is processed and by an aesthetic consciousness, and politics itself is too raw. You want to dismiss a poet, you can say, well, basically, he hasn't assimilated or processed or done anything to make it aesthetic, if there's a document in something. So, this was a way of essentially keeping politics out of what was considered good. And it's really demolishable with two words, Dante Alighieri, because Dante puts people that he hates in hell, political opponents. It's not processed or turned into art. They're there as themselves, and he curses them out. How can the artist who is considered typical from the new criticism of the highest that art can provoke indulge his political passions at the lowest level by putting people in hell? If Dante can do it, anybody can do that, and that's not an objection to their poetry, right? I mean, end of discussion. Now let's move on. You can sort of write anything, right?
Yeah, I think I also appreciated in the talks today and then in the writings that both of you have been doing, just the attempt to kind of reconstruct the literary cultural sphere, the party and political formations that were kind of giving rise to these, as it were, proletarian cultural phenomenon and discussions and critical consciousness and all that sort of thing. So yeah, to me, there was a holistic approach that very much resonated with the way that I try to think about literary production. Chris Nealon is joining us, and Chris has a nice question for Sarah here about new work that's maybe coming out of left of poetry. And could you talk about some of your contemporary writing, some of the stuff you've been doing? I know this has been a pretty good period for writing for a lot of people. I know myself, I've been able to get a lot of writing done, and some others I know have been as well. So I wonder if you can follow that up. What have you been up to in the past couple of years?
Yeah, so my writing slowed during the pandemic for various reasons, but I have been working on 2 new projects that grow out of left of poetry in different ways. One is something shorter that I've been thinking about that sort of thinks about the politics of archival practice, the way that poems sort of act as archival repositories, and the sort of in the context of the politics of literary recovery and thinking about literary recovery and the Depression left. So I'm looking at Olson, who was herself, someone who recovered herself, right, was writing over a long period of time and whose work really remained unfinished, but was also instrumental in recovering working class writers like Rebecca Harding Davis. And then also Rukeyser. I'm interested in how the Book of the Dead also emerges in relation to things like the Egyptian excavation, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the sort of colonial frameworks that some of the work of the Book of the Dead takes place within. And then also another book called I Went to Pitt College, in which a young Smith graduate sort of goes undercover into a mining town and attempts to sort of see what life is like there. And so I've been interested in the relationship between these archival recovery projects and the extractive industries, in part because, my own sort of formation as a person relates to my family's sort of history working in extractive industries. And so that's one sort of piece of what I've been working on. The other project I've been working on is sort of thinking about the ways that sort of neoliberal institutions foreclose possibilities for poetic production and kind of doing an alternate history of Black Mountain College, thinking about the way that the sort of artistic and pedagogical experiments of Black Mountain College took place within Appalachia and sort of the roots of histories of literary institutions in that particular formation. So that's what I've been working on in different ways.
Great. And then Aditya, I know you've been writing some poetry. You recently sent me a chapbook. I wonder if you could talk about some of the stuff that you've been up to. You've been producing a number of interesting essays.
Yeah. So I've been trying to translate this Hindi language Marxist poet Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh for a while now. It's been like for 4 or 5 years it's been going on, and he was notorious for writing these long poems because the poems wouldn't end, and a simple explanation for that was that the history doesn't end, and it's just like, why should my poems end? And he would write these long, very long poems, like 40 pages, 50 pages, drafts of longer poems that he would eventually want to write, but he never did. So that kind of thing. And it was a moment, right? 50s, 60s, India has just gotten its independence and nation building is going on, and the communist movement is like going through different phases and stuff like that. And all of that is in his writing. And as it happens, he was also a prolific political writer who wrote about all sorts of things. Why is the price of wheat falling in India? What relation does it have to the recession in Argentina and to the war in Korea? He was like, he really was like, he really wanted to capture a certain totality that he was existing in India at the time. So I thought that I'll start by taking up one of his shorter poems and translating it into a long, very long poem in the English language. So I started by doing that, and it started off as like Philip is gonna hate me. It started off as a process, of translation, but slowly grew into all sorts of other things as well. I was part of I was meeting these friends and comrades who were trying to run a workers' newspaper at the time. Some of them were already running a university worker newspaper at the time. And slowly the diary I was keeping of my visits to the steel industrial area and the raw materials for the newspaper, they started blending into the poem, and the poem just blew up, and it just continued to blow up ever since. So I think that is so it was just like one shard of that blow up was published last year by Organism for Poetic Research, which is a tiny collective and press at NYU. So yeah, so that is something that I've been working on the side for a while now. And also, yeah, so apart from that, it's just my dissertation that I've been working on, just like trying to find out these, trying to basically blend like ethnography and literary criticism in my dissertation. Try to recover as much as I can.
Thanks so much for those comments. Philip, do you want to make a final comment? I think we're kind of reaching the end here.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to.
I know Aditya's. It's like the middle of the night, so I don't want him to.
That's true. We should. I just wanted to ask Sarah and so forth. I'm fascinated by the reaction to the term document and documentary. Like for example, if you think about it in movies, you can't play documentaries in theaters. People won't go to something called a documentary, you hear, because it sounds like it's something that you're going to have to sit through. You could see it at school in 5th grade, but you wouldn't go to a theater to pay. And yet, of course, when you think Chris Marker, Alexander Kluge, what's now called essay film, it's infinitely more interesting and challenging what's being produced in that than in narrative film, I think. So people gradually overcome that hurdle. It seems that document and poetry is even a higher hurdle to overcome. And why do you think that is in terms of, is it just 20 centuries of a certain view of what poetry is, pretty ethereal,
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of thinking about that in two ways, because, I'm sort of thinking about the emergence of documentary poetry with a text like Rukeyser's The Book of the Dead, or with Reznikov's testimony, or, Tilly Olson's work, and how that was very much received as if it wasn't poetry. And like William Carlos Williams said of The Book of the Dead, that I can't remember the quote off the top of my head. It used to be there. It used to roll right off my tongue, but essentially that they weren't poems, right? But I think that in contemporary poetry, like I think about scholars like Michael Leong, who sort of have charted how, because of particular conditions now, that documentary poetry has actually has flourished and has become a dominant form, in part because of what he calls an impatience with the lyric. So I think it's interesting to think about that longer history of documentary poetics in North America.
Yeah. Well, I do like the term investigative poetics that Ed Sanders came up with in the 60s that you mentioned. I mean, that seems to have a sizzle to it in a way that the musty document doesn't, maybe. We'll see. Well, we would love to continue this discussion, but as David said, it's way past midnight in India, and poor Aditya, we're keeping you up anyway. So I want to thank both Sara and Aditya for their presentations, and David for putting this panel together. Comrade Lau, you are always welcome at Red May to put together any panel you like at any time. I guess I'll end by saying tomorrow, Policing the City, 11 a.m. Join the Starship Red May then as we continue our explorations. Thank you.
And thank you again, Sarah and Aditya, for the great discussion and the great presentations today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the audience.